Dobre utro из Амсквачи, Waskegen, Eleje Edmontona, Canada. Меня зовут Анна-Мария Су, за меня большое честь здесь сегодня. Спасибо моей подруге Светлане Подленко за предоставление возможности. Спасибо нашим коллегам Макушинским. Sorry about my Russian. I'll go back to your translator.
It was great, but Anna-Marie, I think that we will ask you to switch maybe your video because we have a problem with the sound. Yes? Everybody has a problem with the sound? У всех проблема со звуком у Анны-Мари. Да? Анна-Мари, может быть, вы сможете выключить... Sorry, can you switch off your camera that we can hear you better? I think, Anna-Marie, it's your issue with Wi-Fi.
I can hear you perfectly well, and I can hear
now you're good. Now you're good.
Now it's good? Okay. Sorry about this. I thought we had it going. Shall I start again? Dobre jutro iz Amskwachi, Ilije Edmonton, Canada. I'm so happy to be here at the Makushin readings. Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, our hosts. I am a poet, so a servant of the song. I'm a writer and a servant of the possible. What a writer sets down in books serves to outline the known and to declare the dimensions of what is possible. Oh, what a job. So how do you learn to do this job? A poet must listen carefully to her people's stories, for these stories reveal how her people know their place in the great song. It's a very romantic notion, but it's very slippery in a globalized, multicultural world. Who are my people that I may sing for them? You might think of me as an Indian, Krasny Indiets. My father's people, Anishinaabe and Mi'kmaq, they're matrilineal. So to them, I'm Polish, like my mother. Polish people go by patrimony, so I am an Indian to them. The Canadian government agrees. So despite the complexities of my real life, I come to you as a member of Listuguj Mi'kmaq First Nation from the Atlantic coast of Canada. That's my grandfather's reserve, and I would like to offer you a song. I'm sorry about if this messes up the translation, but here we are gathered together in what we call Mawiomi, a gathering to share culture, to share knowledge, to share our sacred selves with each other. In Mi'kmaq, we call that Mawiomi, and we like to start with a song. It's very short. Wechquita chikun gegina ula titnigeya Mawiomi wiskawasi Quiltas quiltam tintanegwe Wechquita chiknis gami chula ditnigeya Nenemi dichtan iltaji kakatumi dich wadaltiwo Wechquita chik Kungegena la ditnigeya Pepquejidima di jnel tipa wehaya yo weha weha wehaya weha wehaya wehaya yo. With that, I wish you that however our languages align and don't align, we can hear each other with our hearts today, for the whole day, the whole evening where you are. Now then, what shall we say about books? You see, I am an Indian, but I'm also half Polish, Western Canadian, prairie, rural, Edmontonian. Where do I fit? I could talk about, and believe me, I thought about it, talk about what the Indigenous writing renaissance has been, how our books have carried our culture and reseeded our languages. I could talk about Rita Joe. I could talk about Basil Johnston, of Gregory Schofield, Jeanette Armstrong, and a whole host of Indians writing a Renaissance. But that's not my story to write. I'm a person between. So I must listen to the stories that fall between. I must learn the songs of people between. Because there are so many stories yet unwritten, and it is these stories unwritten. There's the scope of my work. I must read books to hunt for what they don't say. So I read widely. Every writer must. And what does a book tell us about this global world, about living in Canada, in Amasquatchie-Waskagan, Edmonton? What does it tell us about what it is to be a child of globalization, looking out at a changing world? We don't have time for all the things it tells us. I will share with you 4 books. The first one is this: God is Red, a Native View of Religion. Published in 1973 by Vine Deloria Jr., a Lakota lawyer, theologian, and teacher. This book came out at the time of civil rights for African Americans, sexual liberation for women, the Cold War between the US and Russia, the energy crisis, the hippies moving back to the land. In God is Red, we read of spirituality, of living God. We read of how important it is to speak spiritual truths, to understand God as alive. Because, of course, in Western thought, God had been declared dead in 1884 by Friedrich Nietzsche. And since then, mainstream North American thinkers surrounding us in Canada, as well as in the States, had theorized that maybe this dead God was the problem whenever they felt bad or uncomfortable or needed to write about the problem of being a superpower. Well, it's a theory. But 1884 for Indigenous people is in the era of an apocalypse that is not at all theoretical. Across this land, we and our ways of life were actually under attack, confined to reserves, forbidden to make money, forbidden to travel freely, forced to marry only registered Indians or become exiles in our own homeland. God was not dead, but his abandoned children were making a good run at trying to make sure we were. Worse, people between Indigenous and immigrant cultures fit nowhere. We didn't fit the forced narrative. We were something unaccounted for, and we could not appear in this story. We had to write ourselves into place. In 1982, we changed our government's constitution to include Métis people. My own father served on the committees who made that change happen. But this Métis definition still doesn't encompass my family story and those of so many of us who fall between. No, I had to read more widely to find something broader. I love Vine Deloria's work because he speaks of God in the broadest terms, and he speaks of life in its broadest terms. He speaks not of human definitions for each other, but of the human need to connect ourselves, whomever we are, to the land. This is why he says God is red, because the land is red and our blood is red. And this is true for all humans. There is this red blood that makes us human. There is the redness of the living soil. So we must connect ourselves to the earth. It's a simple task, but a difficult and lifelong task. His writing infuses the writing of all Indigenous people in modern North America, I would say. Whether here in Canada or in the United States, we all speak of the world alight with spirit. We all write the sacred land. In my first book, Fifth World Drum, I wrote of the call to entrain our human hearts to the greater rhythm that abides in the land. This is the original drum, the heart, connected to the original drum, the earth, and the pulse of life is what matters and what calls us home and carries us through all our lives. The second book, here it is, Dag Hammarskjöld's Markings. I never met him. Of course I didn't. He lived and died before I was born, but he too was the seedbed of my life. He was the leader of the United Nations at a time when my father worked for the United Nations. Now my dad was just a simple soldier from the reserve, but going out as a peacekeeper changed his life and caused him to say to his children, whatever you do in the world, look outward. Look out. All around the world, people suffer and people thrive. Find the ways to thrive. And you will find they are always the same ways. And write those things down for people. So I've tried, and Dag Hammarskjöld tried. And I love this book for it speaks of a man who suffered, who worried that he wasn't doing the right thing, who was never sure of himself, if we can believe his moments of inner reflection. Maybe it's only history that makes me think he was always aware he was going to die young in a plane crash in Zambia in 1961. But I read the presentiment of doom in his work and I take it as a caution. Write now. Write forward. Say what you mean to say. So my second book, For the Changing Moon, writes about what is eternal and about seeking for what is eternal, but being aware that whatever we do is so small. It's so small and can never be perfected. Most of the books that I hold up as examples are poetry, not least of them Gary Snyder's Markings, translated by Nanao Sasaki. It's a bilingual edition, and I love the beauty of it. Two codes speaking side by side, English on one side, Japanese on the other. To me, that encapsulates what it is to be a writer. You are always reaching out to people who may not share your language, but who are still seeking to understand. It's very wonderful to be in the Makushin readings, with or without translation, to listen to Russian and to try to understand by the rhythm, by the words that I do know. My grandmother was Polish, my mother was Polish. I spoke a little Polish in the home. So the rhythms are there. The language is different. What can I learn from that? This I always try to find out. And Gary Snyder's Turtle Island reminds me that this is a worthwhile thing to do. So in my own books as well, I try to talk back my language. I try to write in my language. For the Changing Moon, I write in Ojibwe, though I don't speak Ojibwe Moin. In Fifth World Drum, I write in Mi'kmaq, though I speak a little Mi'kmaq only, and mostly I can sing the songs I was taught. But this I owe in part to the beauty of Gary Snyder's work in translation. How odd that all these people influencing me that I speak of today are not Indigenous. What does that mean? Am I a traitor to my race? Should I be writing more and talking more about only being influenced by Indigenous people? No, that's not true. That's not my life. That's not how books have worked for me. It was true when I was a poet that I would look outside, that I would look to people speaking of things I'd never seen for my biggest inspirations. And it's true now that I've moved into writing novels. My first novel, Humane, takes place in Amisquatchie, a version of Edmonton that's even more global than we currently are. It talks about people like me, my people, mixed people, people in whom the threads of various histories all tie together, and we become something new. And our concern is not so much how much of this kind of person are you, how much of that kind of person. Our concern is, how do you act as a human being? And how are you humane? And how do you respect the rest of life? For this book is also populated, you might see by the cover, by people who are not human, but who nonetheless have a gift to bring, a part to play, a wisdom to give us. And I owe that sense of story to this book more than any other novel I've ever read, The Kitchen God's Wife by Amy Tan. She's an Asian American writer, and this is not her most famous work. Her most famous work was The Joy Luck Club. And it pretty much tried to be the North American Asian story. There isn't only one such story, just as there's not one such Indigenous story. This story, to me, is beautiful not because it's about Asian people. It's beautiful because it's about characters I love, who struggle in a huge setting that was thrust upon them, not by their own choice. There are two women who, as young brides, meet in wartime China, and it is the story of their lives together. What does that have to do with me? Not much. But they are people whose heart is clear to me, and this is the power of books. Their heart becomes clear to me. And so I realized this is what I must do for my people, whoever they are, to try to write our hearts clearly so that other people can see them. To try to write our hearts so that other people can say, yes, that too is my heart. This is how my heart sings. This is what I have to bring as a writer. And this is what I have learned from books, that in a well-crafted book, no matter how digitized the world, one can find a private and personal moment to connect with the world beyond, with someone you've never met, whose roots, whose culture, whose language you may not apprehend. But if they're well rendered, then they come into your heart. And there's no like or subscribe button. You don't have to comment. A book is a sovereign thing, and you read it privately to yourself. It's the realm where you alone meet the world. And then what you learn, if you're lucky and you're a writer, you bring into your own work as best you can. That's what I know about books in this multicultural, plural-rooted, digital and international world, that they come from all directions, they reach the heart and tie the heart back to the big world. Thank you. Спасибо.